So it is 12:02, so we're going to get started here. Hello, everyone, a virtual hello, and thank you for being with us. My name is Amanda Soroka, and I am the Assistant Curator of Contemporary Art at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And on behalf of myself and everyone at the museum, I'd like to give a big welcome to you all to the first program in our series, The Production of the Self, Conversations about Marisa Merz. And this has been organized by myself and my colleague, the Marcello Ruma Fellow in Contemporary Italian Art, Dr. Lara D'Amori, who is here. Wave to us, Lara. This series will take place every Wednesday from now until October 21st from noon to 1 p.m. And it will feature the perspectives of a number of different scholars and curators, all speaking to the life and the legacy of the pioneering Italian artist, Marisa Merz. With that, I'll hand this over to Lara to give you some housekeeping rules.
Well, thank you, Amanda, for your kind introduction, and welcome on my behalf too to the first of the series of conversation about Marisa Merz, the first of 7 conversations actually, so bear with us until the end. So this program is made in conjunction with the artist room dedicated to Marisa Merz, currently on view at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. So this artist room features several materials, media, and theme that have crossed the entire production of the artist, and was made thanks to the collaboration with the artist herself, the Fondazione Merz, and Allostal lenders. So if you happen to be in the area, please come to visit and see the room yourself. So before we jump into today's agenda and introduce our guest speakers, Connie Butler, the Chief Curator at PhilaMuseum, Los Angeles, moderated and introduced by Carlos Basualdo, Keith and Katherine Sachs, Senior Curator of Contemporary Art at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. I have a few housekeeping notes for you. So today the program will be organized as follows. Carlos will introduce Connie, and then we have Connie's presentation. And at the end, we will have time for a Q&A. You see you are currently muted, but you can still post your questions in the chat below the screen. You see Charlotte has already greeted you in the chat. So feel free, please, to say hi, to share comments, questions, not just at the time of the chat, but also like during the presentation. So at the end of Connie's presentation, we will do our best to read some of these questions out loud for you. So these conversations, these series are being recorded, but please know that just introduction and presentation will be recorded because we would like for you to feel free to ask whatever questions you want. And the recordings will be available at a later date and shared on the YouTube channel of the Italian Cultural Institute of New York. So before passing the screen over to Carlos, I would extend my heartfelt gratitude also to our sponsor, the General Consulate of Italy in Philadelphia, the Italian Cultural Institute of New York, and the Daniel Dietrich Fund for Excellence of Contemporary Art. So I think it's all for me, and Carlos, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lara. Thank you, Amanda. It's a great honor to be able to introduce Connie, for a curator that I admire, very deeply and have admired for a long time. And the occasion, celebrating the work of Marisa Merz is certainly for us, a great privilege. It's a privilege that starts with the room that we have at the museum and the room in which Amanda Soroka and Lara and I worked together, started long before it was installed. As part of a series of conversations and visits to Marisa while she was alive. Marisa's death took us by surprise. We were hoping not that she would visit because we knew that she wasn't traveling very much, but you know, at least we were hoping to share images with her and to be able to visit and bring news of the room with her. Marisa's absence is followed by another very, very significant absence, uh, that of Germano Cellant, who with whom Marisa worked closely at times at the beginning of her career. And as many of you know, Germano was a very a driving force behind contemporary art in Italy, and specifically, you know, his role as a sort of cement gatherer and promoter of the Arte Povera group, of which Marisa took sort of a marginal part. It's absolutely central. And I'm saying that, you know, Marisa took a marginal part because she, you know, just deliberately, you know, chose that. And what is for us a source of inspiration about Marisa is that she took many positions that could have been seen as peripheral, and constructed, you know, not only an incredible body of work, but a true thinking process behind them that has, you know, truly revolutionary potential. And I'm hoping that through these lectures, we continue the work that started with the retrospective of Marisa that, you know, was presented in Los Angeles and New York, and that we can somewhat deepen the understanding of her work in the Anglo-Saxon world. Just very briefly, I don't really remember when was it that I had the opportunity to meet Marisa for the first time. I think I was at the time working as an adjunct curator at Maxi, and I visited her on occasion of a show that we were preparing at the time with Luigi Leonardelli, who is one of the speakers of this series. And everything about visiting Marisa was special. You know, she was she lived in an apartment in Turin, an apartment in the same building where Michelangelo Pistoletto had his studio for many years, a building done by one extraordinary Italian artist of the 16th century, Juvara. And the building itself was like a sort of a magic cave. It was an experience because very early on, Marisa decided to somewhat take on certain limitations that Italian culture at the time, or you know, or European culture assigned to the role of a female artist. She decided to take them and to adopt them in as a sort of voluntarily, in order to, I would say, question them profoundly, but not only to question them profoundly, but to use them really as a way of completely redefining the very notion of what art is, really. And so, for example, she decided that because of her role as Mario Merz's wife, she would not put herself forward as an artist for many years. She didn't participate in any solo exhibitions. She would only show in group shows, you know, assuming a sort of subordinate position, but in a completely and deeply revolutionary way, you know, and using that position to question notions of authorship and the notion of the artist as a sort of sovereign subject that seems to permeate, you know, our understanding of modern and contemporary art, and provides a sort of point of from which, you know, value and speculative value takes, you know, grasps upon. Another important element, I mean, fundamental element of Marisa was that, you know, she didn't date her works. I mean, the works in many cases were simply things that she did in her home. So domesticity provided the operative context for the development of the work. And she did, you know, did and redid works through the years. You know, they were considered part of her life truly. And I think Connie will talk about that, I'm sure, very eloquently. But again, the resistance of dating the work, the resistance of parting with the work are all extremely important when considered, in the larger field of our understanding of what the art object and art object is. So just to say that, from the point of view of the position that the work occupied for her and the way in which she presented the work, she was able to use a subordinate position to articulate a truly resistant and a truly a true deep inquiry on an understanding of what the position of art is truly. And besides that, the other thing that it was impossible to avoid by spending time with Marisa was to be deeply moved by the profound humanity of her art. And I know that those are complicated words, but it was a feeling of deep empathy that the work itself and the attitude, the sort of positional attitude that the work occupied represented, and a sort of deep moving compassion that the work expressed towards ourselves as viewers. So a deep empathy and a compassionate attitude. And I think that those are all important aspects of the works, and certainly it's difficult to look at the work without thinking about Marisa, and her presence will be missed and felt throughout these lectures. But without much ado, I want to do what I am supposed to do today, which is to introduce Connie. And Connie is chief curator at the Hammer, where since 2013 she has organized a range of extraordinary exhibitions. And Marisa Merz, The Sky is a Great Space, that was presented in 2017, is one of them, together with the great retrospective of Adrian Piper that traveled to MoMA and shows some Paul McCarthy and Mark Bradford and many other extraordinary artists. Let me mention that Connie is the recipient this year of the Audrey Irmas Award for Curatorial Excellence at Bard College. So big cheers and a very well-deserved award to Connie for that. Connie's lecture is titled Time, Process, and Life in the Work of Marisa Merz. So we are super, super happy, Connie, to have you here. And, we were all hoping to see you in person, and this is what we get, but it's great nonetheless. And so there you go. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Carlos. And I want to also just thank Amanda and Laura DeMori and the Philadelphia Museum for this wonderful opportunity and event, and just to congratulate you on the beautiful installation. I think you have a wonderful grouping of works there, and especially that one, the two works that remind me very much of Picasso's guitar are two works I've never actually seen before, and I wish we'd had in our show, and perhaps we can talk a little bit more about them, but they already have me thinking. I'm looking forward to the speakers over the coming weeks as well, and many of them are curators and scholars that I really admire and whose work I know through the work that I did with Marisa Merz that I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to speak kind of informally today. I think it's better for Zoom, but also I want to kind of reflect a bit on Marisa and kind of bring her into the room in this opening talk of this series. So I'm going to share now with you my screen. Okay, hopefully that looks good to all of you. It looks good to me. So I'm going to read some remarks and then I'll kind of talk briefly through my slides. And I want to, as I said, do something kind of personal today, which is breaking in some ways the rules of art history a little bit, to speak about this project that I had the privilege of working on with Marisa, and speak really about, love and passion and empathy, as Carlos said. I think this is an artist that inspires us to actually speak a bit differently and think about art history differently, certainly. And I'm beginning with this picture because it's actually an image I took of Marisa that I was not allowed to show when she was alive, or to, much less publish. And Marisa, as some of you will know, had a very insistent relationship, I think, with her own image, and that is she didn't want it to be used. So I'm going to take a little bit of liberty today and kind of reinsert her and her practice and her life a bit through images. One of the most amusing things for me about returning to Marisa during COVID has been the ways in which technology seems to kind of collude with, or for me anyway, with Marisa, and that many of my images are kind of stuck between the cloud and a database I don't have access to. But I did pull some things for you to see. I have thought of her many times during COVID. First, when Italy was the first country to bravely and heroically shut down. And this is the apartment building that Carlos mentioned, where she did live, and where still you could see the names of Pistoletto and others on the door. I have wondered what Marisa would have thought of all of this and what she would have known. One thing I know is that she would have had an opinion. I've often recalled how she had the news on constantly in her airy bedroom, surrounded by her big angels who framed the television in the middle of the cluster at the foot of her bed. The angels were on wheels, of course, so they could move as they needed to and when they needed to. She knew that the popes and the politicians on the news that she would see daily and was quite clear about what she thought that they should do. On each visit that we made to her in Torino, we would sit in front of the building, in the small cafe outside of this beautiful building, a lovely old ice cream shop from where she enjoyed watching the people go by. Often at the end of the day, with her sitting in that spot before she returned to her studio to paint, the people on the block would say hello, and the shops around the little park of her home all knew her and treated her with great respect and love. I imagine them all singing from the windows of buildings like this during quarantine. One of the things I've thought of frequently returning to Marisa and the exhibition that we've made of her work is what an incredible privilege that it was. Our little team, which I have to mention, consisted of Simone Battisti, our essential guide from Gladstone Gallery, the artist's daughter, Beatrice and Fondazione Merz, who Carlos mentioned, who was always our bridge to the artist, and Ian Altavere from the Metropolitan Museum, who was my collaborator when the show first opened, as well as on the Hammer Museum side, Leslie Coetzee, who's now a curator at the Baltimore Museum. We were all very aware that we were engaging with a history that is vanishing and was vanishing. We were also laboriously following a way of working that has become nearly extinct, I believe, in curatorial practice. Working with an artist in their city and context, in depth and over time, from the flat files and archives to the ice cream cafe on the street, each of these environments produces knowledge. And yes, the privilege of the art world, the excessive travel and bad carbon footprint needed to be checked in a major way, and has been. But now that COVID prevents or curtails this unique privilege, I wonder how this intimate work will be achieved and what it will look like. I've frequently reflected on the ways that the current moment reminds me of a pre-global, pre-internet moment when the only way to experience the studio was to actually go there. And of course, now we can't actually go there. There's something so digital, but also so incredibly analog about now and about how we experience time, which in many ways makes it the perfect moment to revisit Marisa. And I should just say that this studio image was one of a series of beautiful ones that we published in the catalog, but again, kind of absent of her physical presence. And but it gives you some idea of what the studio environment is like. On one particularly memorable trip, we went to the apartment that she and Mario shared in Milan, a place that remains intact as it was left, with toothpaste and soap in the bathroom, as though the artist just left, when in fact they left nearly 20 years ago and might return at any moment. In that apartment, there were piles and piles of drawings, small boxes labeled according to the shows and location that Marisa would travel to, and perhaps most memorably, there were groupings of ceramics and other works everywhere. on the floor, in the corners, and little interventions of copper wire in the arches or alcoves of almost every room in the house. As you see here, she had sort of used the domestic environment to make these temporary installations that would change and be altered over time. I will never personally forget standing in a bedroom, which was kind of shedding dust down on us with a collapsing ceiling, and the works, looking at the works, leafing through a stack of her beautiful and prolific drawings on one of Milan's hottest days in the summer of 2014. As it was in California this past weekend, the heat felt like the Mojave Desert, extraterrestrial and very physical. I remember thinking that this was a rare moment, a privilege to explore an archive of an artist's life, to open boxes that represent her nomadic practice of taking materials and images to a location and creating something alive within the gallery. And this is back at the apartment in Torino as it looked in 2003. It was this notion of Marisa's interventions, of her practice of intermittent engagement, as Carlos mentioned, of bringing life into art, that was recalled and retold by every person still living who came in contact with her work, including Germano Celant, who recalled Marisa's intervention in one of his early Arte Povera exhibitions in Amalfi in 1968, where her intervention was a performance on the beach that I'll show images of in a minute, or in Rome in 1970 when she made a performance at the Uribe airport adjacent to her own gallery exhibition at Attico Gallery, an ephemeral action that only exists in pictures. So there were always these attempts to bring, I think, an element of time and something of the ephemeral within the spaces of the gallery. Tommaso Trini, whose writing on her work from 1975 in Data magazine is still one of the best texts that exists, precisely because it recognizes a kind of feminist insertion of life and the narrative of life into an art that was otherwise abstract and symbolic. Barbara Gladstone, who was of course Mario's champion for many years before she was even able to convince both Mario and eventually Marisa to show Marisa's work. This was a long story of persuasion that is very funny when Barbara Gladstone tells it. And then I also just want to acknowledge Richard Flood, who, when he made his exhibition of Arte Povera at the Walker Museum in the 1990s, I think was one of the people who kind of brought Arte Povera back, and Marisa, who was central in that exhibition, the only woman in that show, brought it back into the focus in the US. As well as more recently, a younger generation of artists who I think are a lot responsible for bringing Marisa back into focus in the early 2000s. I think she was really kind of brought back to attention through a younger generation, including Tessa Dedeen, whose beautiful film portrait of Mario Merz is interrupted for a moment by a fleeting image of Marisa in the background, who crosses through in the yard and somehow steals the show, as she often did. So with this kind of just brief introduction and images, I'm gonna kind of show you images from the exhibition that we made and talk about kind of three thematics, I think, that run throughout her work and that begin to sort of, for me, characterize or answer the question of what it was that she introduced into Arte Povera so importantly, and what it was so hard for critics, I think, to name at the time. Celant, reflecting back on the Arte Povera years, called Marisa's particular approach to content and form a new humanism, by which I believe he was describing the incorporation of her life, her motherhood, her communal collaboration with Mario into her work and her gallery presentations. I'm sure that over the course of these talks, we'll find other answers to these questions. But let me begin now and just show you some images of our exhibition. Before I leave this image, I just want to mention that this room in the studio, or in the apartment rather, was kind of adjacent to where Marisa actually made her work. And it was a kind of ongoing installation that that combined her own work within this framework of the kind of igloo and spiral structure of this table that was in fact Mario's work. And every time, I mean, this is a very neat and cleaned up image, you know, for the book and, you know, for sort of the public. But in fact, this room was an ongoing installation where she would rotate this selection of heads of violins, the wax violins that you see there in the foreground, and a presentation of drawings on the wall. And each time we went, it changed, and in beautiful ways. And there was a sort of inventory of works that populated the floor beneath these very beautiful tables. So this just existed in the apartment alongside her studio and Mario's. So the first thing I just want to talk about is architecture, because I think that the exhibition was really situated very beautifully 3 different times in 3 different architectural situations that kind of highlight the ways in which Marisa's work takes on and takes in the architecture in which it's shown. This was the opening of our show at the Hammer Museum called Marisa Merz, "The Sky is a Great Space," which is a quote from her. And we began with one of these beautiful fountains, as you have at the Philadelphia Museum, because I wanted very much for the first encounter to be with something live, because there often was, especially in Marisa's early exhibitions up to about 1985, or 1980 to 85, when the production of her ceramic work kind of took over, there was always, or very often, the presence of something organic that engaged with time, either through the fountains and the water, through the element of wax, sticks, other things that she would gather and bring in from nature. The work on the right is the altalena, the swing, that was also important, I think, to show right at the beginning of the show, because it introduces this aspect of her life and maternity. This is a swing, apparently, that she constructed for her daughter Beatrice. It's very hard for me to imagine putting a child on that, but that's also an interesting kind of tension that I think Marisa had, even an ambivalence about her own motherhood. You know, this tension between something that is obsessive and takes over one's life, but also prevents one from working. So I think there is that kind of mixed relationship with it throughout her work. The living sculpture, of course, and I'll show you several images of it, is perhaps her best known work, because it was featured in the Arte Povera exhibitions from the 1990s. This is this amazing installation, which is originally from 1966, that was made in the artist's apartment, that I'm sure other speakers are going to talk about in depth. The most significant grouping of it is there on the far wall on the left and owned by the Tate now. So it's often on view and has become kind of a stand-in for what was actually an installation that eventually kind of overtook the family apartment, and particular in the kitchen, which was, I'll show you in a minute, sort of the kitchen where we did a lot of our work and meetings with Marisa. But it was this, it also, though was called after the fact a living sculpture, and certainly has references to the organic, and was a very immersive installation. It also, I think, was a kind of architectonic one that took over, kind of had a menacing presence, according to Beatrice, even within the family home. So again, this kind of ambivalent relationship. But I think that one of the things that's lost, because so little of her early installations are still exist, is the kind of architectural ambition of the work and the material ambition of it. And you see it in the living sculpture, but for the most part, a lot of the early installations are gone. This is a beautiful piece that Marisa made more recently in the early 2000s, when she had an exhibition at Fondazione Merz, and she kind of brought in this nautical light and paired it with some of the knitted triangles that you see here, and some copper tubing or piping that she found to kind of recreate this installation. So this recycling of materials was something that she frequently did, particularly in early installations. But again, to kind of bring this element of light right into the exhibition was important, I think. We attempted in many ways, and of course it's not possible, but one of the significant problems that Carlos will also really recognize is how to bring to life in an exhibition, in a museum, in this very static environment, something of the studio and the feeling of how the artist works. So on the right is an image, just my own snapshot from this kitchen in the apartment where all of these works, kind of salon style, were put on the wall. And as you see, kind of using binder clips and whatever was around, she would put these things up on the wall and move them around. So you see the Joan of Arc collage there, for example, on the right, and then our attempt to kind of pay a bit of an homage or nod to this salon style kind of grouping that she would, these really immersive, almost installations that would take over all the walls of her studio and apartment. The tables are really important, I think. The table as a surface, an open work table that she not only worked on. I showed you the tables of Mario's that were ongoing and always evolving. We managed to have these open tables in our installation, which I thought were quite beautiful, but pose this problem too of how do you even arrange these ceramics? And it's a sort of strange question of, does one mimic the gesture of the artist? Does one try to do that in the absence of the artist's presence, or simply kind of gesture to it? And I'll talk more about the ceramics in a moment. The exhibition then went to the PhilaMuseum, which is of course this incredibly beautiful piece of architecture from the 1990s in Porto by Cisa, the Portuguese architect Cisa. And we brought into the show there the spiral table. So again, trying to sort of bring this image from the studio right into the exhibition. But one of the beautiful things at Cervalvis is all of these windows that in some cases, as you see on the right, are actually on the same plane as the grassy outside. And I thought it was so beautiful to have this pairing of nature and her work, because it's something that she herself tried to do. But here we really could do it very much through the architecture of the museum. And then finally, the museum in Salzburg that you see there on the hill in the distance was a very severe kind of space. Concrete floors, lower ceilings, really a sort of kind of modernist box. And the exhibition was beautifully situated there as well. And we recreated a number, or this wax piece that I'll talk more about the use of wax in a minute. And this was actually the opening of the exhibition at the Met Breuer at the time, a piece of architecture that was by Marcel Breuer, but also from 1966, the same year as the living sculpture. So seen in this kind of brutalist architecture, the sculpture was absolutely muscular and held the space quite beautifully, and was a very different experience than it would then be anywhere else. Here is just an image also from the Met, just showing you again the kind of problem of trying to bring in these very specific kind of moments from her domestic vocabulary, let's say. The swing, the little stool on the right that is covered with copper netting, and the table in the middle there, which is also meant to have a live flower coming out of it. But how to enliven these things in the museum environment, I think, is one of the very biggest challenges with the work. This image I like very much. Again, I know others are going to speak about it more fully, but you can see on the left the living sculpture kind of surrounding the television set, and then peeking through on the right a little bit of Mario's studio there. And you can see the Fibonacci numbers there in neon, but this kind of close proximity and almost very claustrophobic environment that they lived and worked in is important, I think. I think I will skip that. One interesting question about the sort of architectural challenge that I think is within the work is thinking about how in her very early installations, that galleries were in the late 1960s, early 70s in Italy, but also internationally, kind of moving from more domestic spaces into kind of industrial spaces. We think of like the Leo Castelli Gallery in New York as an example that maybe we all know, but certainly Speroni, Sargentini, these other gallerists were doing the same in Italy. So there was a moment where she suddenly could take advantage of a more kind of industrial situation, as she did here at the Venice Biennale. You see her installation that I think I don't actually know, but I think must have been in the, maybe not the Arsenale. I'm not actually sure in what building it was. But you see there the copper squares that are actually an early manifestation, I think, of probably part of what you now have at the museum, as well as the little stool in the middle there. And then a more recent, well, from 1976, but a more recent installation of the same piece, which now has a kind of set arrangement that it follows, but adapts to the architecture that it's installed in. And then this example, which is, I think, one of the most beautiful works, but which has kind of become a sculpture, but originated as part of the architecture of the gallery of Salvatore Alla. So you see the piece on the floor with the copper netting kind of shining there, that she then spread over this, what was essentially a big sliding door, a kind of industrial door that she would take out of the space and make into a work. And here's just a close-up of it, because I think you can see, you know, the way she allows the sort of the newspaper, all the existing surface and kind of patina on that door to become part of the work with this overlay of the copper wire and the knitted squares, which is then just wound up into a little spool that she leaves there into the final object. This is a work that belongs to Glenstone and is now exists as really an object, but began as a remnant of architecture. And then the work on the left, this beautiful angel, where she, again, you can see her kind of marshaling materials from at the time that she showed it, these big beams that were added to this beautiful angel, painting of an angel, and then one of the little wax balls that are really from her kitchen, this casting of wax into bowls that she often did, and inserted those spheres almost like a kind of punctuation to kind of finish a work and anchor it to the walls of the gallery. There's a close-up of it. The next kind of just category that I think is interesting to think about, and I know I need to go much faster than I'm going, is just that of process, that there's always this element of making that I think is in the work. And I'm going to go through the drawings very, very quickly, but the drawings were made often in an itinerant way, using materials that she would find when she would travel with Mario to one of his exhibitions or to one of her own. But as you see on the left, in a very kind of casual manner, she would, you know, take the back of a mailing envelope or whatever materials were at hand. And so discovering these drawings was really about, you know, Carlos mentioned the problem of the dating. Sometimes we could date things because of a particular stack of paper, a kind of paper that we knew had been used or found in Japan, for example. But for the most part, the materials are wide-ranging. In this case, the drawing is made on a very not archival piece of chipboard, this very beautiful pastel. And there are two of these that exist. I'm going to go kind of quickly through these to get to the ceramics, which I think are also very process-based, although they look less so. That is that they're unfired. And one of the reasons, my theory for why they're not fired is because she didn't have the patience actually, and didn't want the kind of to close the question of their process by firing them. So they're extremely delicate. They're made really usually with the impression of her hand or an elbow or a part of her arm into the ceramic block. And one can think of a child's block of clay, for example, that comes out of the box as a big rectangle. Sometimes it was barely altered from that original form. And it was really the cheapest kind of clay that she would often use. Sometimes she had access to terracotta and other things. But these are actually, though there's more static works now, incredibly kind of process-based works, I believe. And then finally, the question of time, which I think is maybe the most important question for me within her work. The chronologic time or lack of it, her disruption of chronology, and it's a really insistent disruption. We tried many times to, in the beginning, sort of attach dates to things, and that was not possible. It was not desired and it was not possible. But these early actions where I think time is really an important element, like the action at Uribe Airport, where she, she was in that airplane describing in a very almost pseudoscientific way the altitude as the plane took off and then landed at the airport, and then her notes, the recording of her kind of narration of that event, were recorded on the drawing board that you see there, and that was then dragged into the exhibition in Rome and included as part of it. But time also, very importantly, I think, in terms of her maternal time, this sort of the way in which her life as a mother kind of punctuated her work, not only punctuated, but I think actually completely informed it. And she allowed that to become part of the, the fabric of the display. You see here her with Beatrice and the Bea, the spelling out of her daughter's name, this beautiful knitted nylon piece that she left to interact with the ocean stage and interact with the ocean. These are the little scarpette, which are the shoes from Beatrice, and here a beautiful picture of Marisa kind of wearing the shoes themselves. Maybe I'll just skip now to some last remarks, and then we can go to conversation. I guess I wanted to quote Anne-Marie Boetti, who was in her very important article, Negative Capability as Practice in Women's Art, talked about this notion of, articulated further this notion from Kristeva of woman time or woman's time, and the notion of the feminine as the moment of rupture and negativity, which conditions the newness of any practice, she says. She describes the woman artist, Boetti does, as entering the double space of incongruence, by which I mean that she can still be read and appreciated through the cultural criteria of the avant-garde, formal quality, and so on, but also through another criterion as a landmark of an alien culture, with reference to other values and mind schemes. Artists like Marisa Merz, she says, have answered the historical non-recognition of women's production by their spontaneous non-recognition of cultural standards. She never belonged and overcame the current values of art. She could not care less. And so I wanted to just conclude with some images of Marisa. The one, these from her earlier life with the scarpette on the bottom left, an image from La Conta, which is her counting. It's a very short video from 1968 where she's counting peas and moving them from a plate to a bowl. And then, of course, this image of her with the living sculpture. But also I wanted to include the image of Marisa receiving the Golden Lion in Venice in 2013, which is one of the highest awards, as we know, in the art world. This picture was recirculated when she died, as if to validate and bring closure to a career that had in so many ways eluded the art world. The trip to Venice to receive the award was Merz's last out of Torino. Though in very good health, she didn't want to make the journey of a few hours by car, but she was persuaded to, and she went. I believe that even in this press image from that day, that you can see a mischievous look in her eye, barely tolerating the intense gaze of the media and the art world's desire to consume a part of her. On our first trip to the studio to research our show in 2014, we noticed that the Golden Lion was sitting on the floor in the corner of the studio, still in a small Venetian shopping bag, having been tossed aside immediately upon re-entering the apartment and left in a corner of Mario's studio, which is hilarious, actually. I think that it's Mario's studio, not hers. As you've heard, she shared the living space with Mario, and both studios, his dormant and hers alive and remaining active. We laughed seeing this gesture and recognizing it immediately for what it was, a rejection of convention, of chronologic time, and the markers of a career. Venice or not, Marisa picked up where she left off with her angels. And I just finished with this image of Marisa, which is kind of one of my favorites, which is of her fleetingly leaving the galleries of the exhibition in a very beautiful exhibition that she made in Naples. And it's one of the pictures that she approved of, I think, because she was seen from the back. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and go back to Carlos.
Thank you, Connie. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
A big round of virtual applause.